Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Biz Bites. Now, I've got a guest that we've had before on the show, and the reason we're doing that, he kind of challenged me to turn things around a little bit to ask me a few questions. So I thought that sounded like a reasonable idea to do. So, Rik, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I really appreciate you taking up this opportunity because, I know that over the years you've been interviewing all these people and, we're all finding about all these people, but we're not hearing any of the pearls of wisdom that are coming from you.
No pun intended, right?
Pun intended.
Yeah.
So I thought that it would be a good idea to talk with you about your business. And I think a good place to start is, we said on one of your podcasts, we spoke about that quite often business people know their business people fairly early on in their lives. They might go out and, sell something, sell lemonade at their, front of their house, or find something to make some money from. And they quickly get hooked on this idea that ideas can sell. And so my question to you is, when did you know you were a business person? Did you have one of those experiences growing up?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So my very heavily influenced, obviously, by my father, but also my grandfather. And so my grandfather or my grandparents, indeed, were Holocaust survivors. And so when they came to Australia, they had literally nothing. And they had the wherewithal not only to survive, but then to establish their own business. And they started a clothing business for children that really they had nothing. And they didn't even necessarily have experience in that area before. I'm not entirely sure why they chose that particular area, but they did. And they started that business and grew it enormously through huge amounts of hard work over the years, but a definite love for it. And obviously, we witnessed that it was well and truly established by the time myself and my sister came along. And so we were the grandchildren being dressed by their clothing label at that time. And that was, that was definitely a huge influence in terms of that entrepreneurship. And indeed, my father, was a pharmacist, and, seeing how he had his own business and had that control. And I think when I first started working for anyone, realizing the lack of control was a huge influence. And I actually remember my first job was in Grace Brothers. For those of you that are not old enough, that's Myers these days, but it was Grace Brothers in those days, and it was, I think, amongst one of the smallest stores that they had. And I remember I started working, and I was working in the men's area. And day one, and I had someone come up to me and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, could you tell me where such and such department is?" And I started walking them there to that department, and and generously kind of handed them over to where it was when we got close enough. As I got back, my manager kind of rapped me over the knuckles and said, "You're allowed to point in the general direction. You're not allowed to leave your station and move that way." And I thought, well, that's just ridiculous. That's not good service. What's going on here? And I think that I think I similarly experienced those frustrations over the years when I was working for other people, where I felt that need, that I wanted to do things my way. And it was very interesting. I was working for what ultimately became a publicly listed company, and quite large at the time. And I had a terrific relationship with the CEO. And I remember one day having a conversation with him and saying, "I want to go out on my own." And he said to me at the time, "You're not ready." And I actually took that on board. And he was, certainly in hindsight, he was absolutely right. I wasn't ready. And I think then I perhaps got in my own way for a little while, and probably didn't go out on my own as soon as I might have done. But I remember hearing an interview one day with Jerry Harvey and John Singleton being interviewed together. They're two great mates. And I can't remember which one. I'm pretty sure it was Jerry Harvey who said, if you haven't gone out on your own as an entrepreneur by the time you turn 40, it's never going to happen. And I was 39 at the time, and I went, that's not good. I need to go out on my own. And I remember having a conversation with a colleague that I'd worked with over the years in different ways, and he said, "Just do it." And literally within 2 weeks, I did it. And a few circumstances collided, which made that quite possible. And I've been hooked ever since. And I think that's so the entrepreneur's journey is a really different one, perhaps, to the reason why I do what I do. But it's certainly very heavily influenced, particularly, I guess, by my upbringing and having family that always had their own business. So it's just that independence is something that I guess I've always craved, and the idea of being employed again just fills me with dread.
So your motivation was very much about having that freedom rather than having that control over the top of you. And so you went out and you started your journey on your own. What was the biggest challenge you had in the very, very beginning? Because was it a mindset thing? Was it a system thing? Was it a structural thing? What was it?
I think
what was the biggest challenge?
I think it was as much about mindset and confidence, and knowing if I was going to be able to, sink or swim, as they say. I kind of set myself simple goals where, I'd left a job that I'd been in for a while. I had a bit of a payout that would keep me going for a short period of time. So I'd set I'd set sort of goals of saying, look, if I don't have a client by this point, then I'm going to need to look for a job. I quickly passed that point, and it sort of kept going from there. But I think I remember very distinctly the first main piece of work that I had, and I still tell the story to people about what happened there, and I certainly won't name who the client was, but I remember they engaged me to run a series of workshops to help define the organization a little bit better. And I knew a little bit about who they were, but I wanted to do my research beforehand so I could work out how I was going to target these workshops that I'd said I would run. And I got my foot in the door, by the way, by someone who I'd worked with previously, who'd moved to this organization, who found out I was going on my own and said, "You'd be great for here." And I remember I rang the reception. Well, I first did my research online and looked at, and I realized that the messaging that they had was not matching anywhere. What you saw on social media didn't match what was on the website, and it didn't match what was in their, brochures and reports. There was just this confusion. And I rang their reception and said, "Can you tell me a little bit about the organization, what they're doing? I'm doing some research." And the reception sort of went, yeah, look, is it, would it be okay if I put you through to a manager? And I said, no, that's fine. Let's just leave it at that. And I kind of had a realization of knowing what I needed to do, how to get started. And I've realized that more and more over the years that where I have a particular skill is in that restarting and that reconfiguration of people, and making people realize that where they need to realize that, and making it obvious to them, so that we can move forward from there. And that particular organization, I remember I walked into a meeting that we had everyone from board members down to, general workers, in what was a reasonable size organization. And before they started and any discussion was started, I asked them all to grab a piece of paper without talking to anyone and say, please write down in a sentence or two what the organization does. And I then took all of those. It was we weren't at the point where everyone was having laptops on their desk, so had to do a bit of the hand collating things and reading things out. But nobody was even close to agreeing with one another. Like, they just didn't even know what they did. And so it was great to find that starting point and going from there. And I think that has been, it was symbolic of what I was doing in my early career as well, because my career started largely in radio, and probably the first main job that I had outside of university. Well, it wasn't the first main job, but it was the biggest job that I had, was in working on a talkback program where the audience was minimal, and the format of the show was terrible, and we needed to change that. So I worked with the announcer quite closely, and we changed that and rebuilt an audience, and built it to a point where we were the leading audience on the station that had, the biggest names in radio at the time were on that station, and we were a bigger audience than they were. And most people didn't realize that. And I think there was a lot of lessons out of that has just carried on through my career in reestablishing those foundational elements and growing audiences in an authentic way.
So what you had in the beginning was, to me, sounds like it was kind of like the stepping stones ultimately that would lead you to your current business, because isn't that what you do in your current business?
100%.
You bring people together, you get them unified, you get them focused, and you help them to be able to get that common message. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it all dates back to, a fascination I had when I was a little kid with radio. I remember my parents bought me a crystal radio set that you had to build. Right. When I say build, it wasn't too much. It was string a couple of wires together, right? But it was one of those things you did. I've still got it somewhere tucked away in a cupboard in a box somewhere. But there's and I ran wires out the window and everything in order to be able to listen to the radio and listen to more than just the standard kind of AM radio at the time. And I remember being not only excited about listening to it, but it was sharing the information that I'd heard that I knew other people wouldn't have heard, and sharing that. In those days, it was, sharing it in school to the other kids, and that continued on forever. So my fascination was always in that ability to share the messages and build those relationships. And I think that's the key thing that I've learned as well. It's building one-on-one relationships with people. And that's definitely been a major focus for the business, in the programs and things that I offer. It's really about how do you tell stories that authentically engage people, because it was the biggest lesson from building large audiences in radio. It's actually not about the masses. It's about making sure you're having a conversation with one person. And if people feel like you're talking to them, or they're feeling like they're really glad to be a fly on the wall to that conversation, then you're going to win much more than trying to talk to everybody. And it's an important differentiation in the way you approach things. It works massively in radio, and it works in business even better. And I think too often people try to be everything to everybody, and in so doing are nothing to anyone. You've got to have those specific conversations and be authentic and storytell. And that's the big thing that I've loved is, if I go back to the kid and it was me telling stories of what I'd heard overnight, to the telling this, businesses telling their stories, when we talked in a previous podcast, you sharing your story. And I love that. I love people's stories of what's motivated them and why they've got into it and what their journey is. And I think that's the fascinating thing, is that you and I probably talk to a lot of businesses who effectively are the same profession, right? I know you talk to a lot of coaches. I talk to a lot of people in different professions. That might be accountants, or could be anyone. But it's easy to say, look, an accountant is an accountant is an accountant. A coach is a coach is a coach. After all, they're all using the same principles. Surely they're the same. But the truth is, we're all an accumulation of our own experiences, and the way we adapt and tell, help our clients is all about our experiences and what's driven us, what we've learned, and how we read a particular situation. And these are things that AIs and the like can't overrun and do. because we understand the nuances of humanity, and that we're also adapting from our own experiences of whatever's going on for us at any given point in time. And that's, to me, has always been the big driver and passion, is being able to share that. That's why I'm doing, just this program as well, because those stories often just get locked away, and I love being able to share them.
Yeah, well, I guess it's like, as you started when you were talking about, your grandparents being, Holocaust survivors. I mean, that was one of the biggest stories in the world.
Mm.
And it was a dreadful story, of course, we know. But there were, many great stories that came out of that story. I'm thinking immediately of Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, for
Yes,
example. A very inspirational story, but it brings us back to our humanness, doesn't it? And, it's something
it
that, as you
does.
say, an AI bot cannot do. It cannot really be human. And stories have that magical component that bring us together, don't they?
They absolutely do, and it's what makes you relatable to the next person, because stories reveal a lot about your values. Just that snippet of that story tells you very strongly that family means a lot to me. That
Yes.
it's going to reveal my religion. It's going to reveal lots of things about me with just a small area. And if you relate to that, you're going to want to engage and hear more. If you don't relate to that, that's fine, because that means our values don't align with one another. There's nothing wrong with that. It just means someone else might be more suitable to your needs than I am. And it goes both ways, of course. And I think that's what that is. Those stories, and those stories that we're connected to have an influence on us. I know there's been some research in that. It's really interesting to think about. There's, survivors have their story, and it's a very dramatic story. And there's so many amazing stories within those stories. I'm fortunate that my grandparents wrote for us, for the family, a book about their story, and it's unbelievable what they did to survive. And then that obviously has an impact on the next generation that comes through. But in fact, it's actually the generation after that, my generation, which is being impacted even more so than perhaps my parents' generation was. And so those stories and that legacy of being able to continue those things as well, because that's the truth, is that generation that was my grandparents passed away some time ago, but that generation is almost completely gone now anyway, because those people are all in their late 80s at the youngest, and mostly in their 90s. And so there's a carriage of their stories needing to go forward, but there's also the implications of what happened and what that does to you, psychologically, as well as that drive that you might have as well. So there's a lot that goes on in all of those things, and stories are so powerful in being able to do that. And I often talk to people about how they say, oh, story and business, surely they don't go together, but they do. It's what makes you memorable. And
Absolutely.
if you don't think, and I often say this to people, that anyone listening right now, I don't know who's listening right now, and I certainly don't know anything about you. And yet I can guarantee you know the story of Noah's Ark. And I guarantee that you have two reactions to it. You believe it or you don't believe it. But either way, it's an emotional reaction. And either way, you know the story. That's incredibly powerful. And business has to do the same. If you think about the brands that you love, they're all busy building stories around the image that they want to project and who they want to engage with most. And many of those big corporate brands spend a lot of money trying to develop stories, but at a small business level, it's very much about the individuals that are running it. And it's their stories that we need to share. The reason an accountant is not an accountant is because of the stories of the people that are behind it. and the way that they interpret things and their stories behind it, who they work with and who they want to deal with. That's what the power is. And that to me is his story is everything that I love sharing, and in every aspect of what I do, even in parts of the business where we build websites, it's still about storytelling. For me, my Better Biz program is about storytelling. Branding is about storytelling. When I'm working one-on-one with clients in my Navigator program, it's about building those stories and unlocking all the keys to that so that we can work out ways to share them with more people. And that's the power of it. And it's what engages each of us.
I'm completely on page with you there. It's, when we do our speaker training program, of course, our students say, what am I going to talk about? Where am I going to start? And the answer that I will often give to our students to answer that question is, you start off by making that audience feel welcome. Be very quick with that, because they're going to expect that. But now give them the unexpected. Tell them your story. Tell them why you've earned the right to stand up in front of them. And, that all comes down to a story. And the biggest fear pattern that most people from a public speaking perspective have is they're going to come out with information and data, and they've got to remember that. And their biggest fear pattern is, what if I forget it? You'll never forget your own story. No. If you come out with statistics and numbers and percentages, you're likely to forget those. So don't start with those. Start with your story. So it's hugely, hugely relevant. How important do you think it really is? You mentioned this earlier about business and stories. A lot of people don't glue them together and join those dots. But you and I both know how important stories are. But why do you think businesses don't really fully grasp how important a story is?
I think most businesses don't understand the principle of engaging and marketing to audiences. And I prefer to use the term engagement to marketing, because I think marketing has this broad term that people don't really understand, but the idea of engaging people, people understand a little bit better. I think that most people say, oh, I don't need to, I hear this all the time. Oh, I don't really do any marketing. And I said, well, where did you get your clients from? Oh, they've mostly come from referrals and started off with people we know. So how did you get them? At the end of the day, you're engaging with people, right? And most of us relate to the idea that we've all picked up clients from this scenario. We get invited to a friend's place who's invited other friends along. And they say, and of course you meet the person, hey, Rik, nice to meet you. What do you do? Oh, this is what I do. This is what I do. Oh, and someone says, oh, you might, there's something that's relatable. And you start trading stories with one another. Yes, I had someone who did this, or I knew someone who did this, or do you do this something because I've had this experience? And that's where you're basically throwing stories at one another to work out, is there a potential relationship here? And that happens at a personal level as much as a business level, right? Because if you throw stories at one another, if you meet someone at a party and they're like, oh, I'm single, I've never wanted to have a family, I work, I make sure I work, 6 or 7 days a week, and I'm usually working, 16-hour days. And you've got someone else who's there and saying, oh, look, I'm very much a family person. I work in between. I've got older kids. Like, the truth is you're just not going to have a relationship, because your value system is completely different. And you get that by trading a few stories. And so you might enjoy each other's company at that particular event, but chances are you never see each other again. But we've all been in that situation where you've met someone and you've maybe even become tighter friends than the original person that invited you to their place in the first place. So it is, to me, it's human nature. That's how we do that, by trading stories. And you can either be waiting for those one-on-one opportunities to say, oh, Rik, could you invite me over to your place this weekend and make sure you invite some people I don't know? Like, that's just not going to happen that often. And the same is turning up only at networking events. You only meet so many people all the time. That's why the power of using social media tools, websites, and those sorts of things, and being able to share your story, bigger events where you can share your stories, that's where people will go, oh, that's the guy I want to deal with. And I know when we spoke in a previous podcast, that's how you built your audience, right? It's that sharing that story, and then more people wanting to share. You're going to love Rik and what he does. And that's where that power is, because you give them that story to share.
Yeah, there's a thing that I remember seeing some of Robert Dilt's work many years ago, which he calls logical levels. And it goes from essentially environment, behavior, capabilities, values, beliefs, and the big one, spirituality, or why you do what you do. And so a lot of people will start from an environment, why are you here? Where do you live? And then there will be some people that start a conversation at the next level, which is your behaviors. So why do you do what you do? And now we're starting to get to a story level. We're getting to a point of story or deeper level engagement. And some people are always very shallow in, where do you live? Where do you come from? But a lot of people don't take that next level step. Why did you live there? Where were you before that? And that starts forming the connections and stories. So
Absolutely.
Do you have a formula to start? Like, for people listening right now, they're probably thinking, oh, gee, do I really have a story in my business? Where do you typically think that they should start to get more engagement in their business from the story perspective?
Well, I think, and I know we've spoken about it before as well, is that the why and purpose is so incredibly important. I think digging into that and understanding why you're involved in that particular business and the story behind that. And, sometimes it dates back a long way. Sometimes you have to scratch a lot further to do it. And I once heard it said that the best way to get to the why is simply get a partner, or, I work with clients and do this, where effectively what you're saying to them, every time someone gives you a response, you say, but why? And until you become very annoying in doing that. And it's until you get to a moment where you kind of feel the tingles down your spine, and remember something that you didn't remember otherwise. It does take a bit of prompting. I know I worked with a client recently where she was doing a particular aspect of the law, and she's been doing it for a long time. And I kind of went, well, why do you do that? She went, I don't know, just always done it. And I said, well, why'd you become a lawyer in the first place? She goes, just chose law. And I went, but law takes a lot of effort to study for, and you need to be pretty smart to do it. I said, so you could have chosen just about any career you wanted to. You've obviously got the intellect to be able to do that. And we kept pushing and pushing in it. And then we sort of took a different tact as well. And I said, tell me about your childhood and when you came from. And suddenly it all made sense. And it made sense to the point where I remember this. I was 7:30 at night, and I happened to be in Bunnings with my wife, and suddenly I get a text message. Who the hell is text messaging me at this time of night? And it was this particular person said, I've had a breakthrough. I realized why I was doing what I was doing. And she sent me the whole kind of detail about her story. And we've picked that up since then. And I think that's the starting point. I think you have to scratch behind that surface and find that driver. And then you have to realize that there is a story to tell that is involved in that. And because that's what's people going to relate to. I know in her particular case, it had a lot to do with parents that moved her from country to country. And there was a story that was involved in all of that. And I think that's, we all are a product of all of those things. And when you share that, you bring people towards you, some who might have similar stories, but others who appreciate your story and trust the journey that you've been on. Because at the end of the day, this is about building like, know, and trust. It is a very simple concept, but that is also the story arc, right? I say to people, when you go to a bookstore, you look at the title of a book, and then you might read the back cover, summary of it. You think, oh, I like this a little bit. And then you start reading the first chapter and you get to know some of the characters. And it's not until you've got to that point that you start to trust the journey that you're going to go on and therefore finish the book. And I think that's what we have to do in business as well. You want to build that like, know, and trust. It's not an instant thing, because unless you're selling something that's for less than $100, it's going to be about building like, know, and trust before people are willing to invest. And particularly if you're talking about, professional service-based areas where people are potentially spending thousands of dollars with you over long periods of time. You have to build that. And it starts with the story. It starts with the stories that you share before they even pick up the phone and ring you. It's the stories that they hear that make them want to say, this is potentially someone I could do business with, because they're not just another pick your profession. And that to me is what the key. You have to realize that as a key starting point. And honestly, it does take working with someone to really get that out. And whether it's someone like me or any number of other people, but I think it's very hard to do it on your own. I think you need someone else there to guide you and to push you and to know that when you're not quite there yet. And it can be huge when you get that revelation.
So you talk about the hero's story. You reference that at one particular point, their story arc. And so right now we've got people listening to what you're talking about. And there, no doubt, are some people who are probably scratching their head and thinking, yeah, that's making a lot of sense. I would do better in my business if I absolutely knew my story and knew how to convey that throughout all my material, through my brand, through my talks, through my social media, etc. So I'm going to ask the obvious question. How do they start with you? What's the first step?
Well, look, really, the first step with me, obviously we have a conversation, because I think it's at the end of the day, you have to feel comfortable with one another, that we're the right match for one another. And, can I work with everyone? In theory, yes. In practice, we may not have the same value alignment. We may not be the right people for one another. So it starts with a conversation. But often I like to work with people in that one-on-one scenario for a little while before we talk about any of the other things that we can do, because it enables us to go a little bit deeper, but to start changing the way you think about things. And I think that's such an important thing to do. Every business is slightly different. And one of the key questions I ask businesses early on, saying, what are the percentage of clients that you have that you love? And, invariably, the percentage is usually around about 10 to 20% maximum. And so the obvious thing is, right, do we have to ditch 80% of the clients? Or is it the way you're thinking about those 80% of clients that's wrong? And if you've got your story right and you get your brand right, then you can think about how you're delivering for those clients to actually turn that around. I did that with a client recently, and we went back and reviewed it, and she's gone from a situation where it was literally that, it was 5 to 10% that she loved, and she's now gone, you know what, I think it's actually 95%. She worked out that even the small ones that she thought she hated, if she put a little twist on it that was in tune with her brand and who she is, that suddenly those little things that were more of an annoyance and smaller clients in terms of the dollar amount and what's involved, actually became quite joyful as well, because she could do just something little that makes her stand out and is true to her brand and who she is, that differentiates her in the market. And if you can only do that by doing the work. And I think that to me is it starts with a conversation. We can do an assessment on where you're at, but we basically sit down and say, look, let's start working one-on-one and giving you some of that direction, find out what you're doing, what you're not doing, and start with those foundational elements and do that. And I think it's also important to realize that it's a bit like they talk about when you paint the Harbour Bridge, that once you get to the end, you got to go back to the beginning again. And that's the same with all of this stuff. You know, a lot of this stuff requires reviewing on an annual basis because the world changes, you change. And so what's true today may not be as true in a year's time for lots of different reasons. So you've got to have a check-in and make sure that it is, and keep tweaking and sharing those stories, because it's always going to keep varying and building.
Excellent. So now I know we've twisted today's interview. In fact, you know, instead of you interviewing me, I'm interviewing you. So I'm going to ask you the final question and the most important question, and the question you have not yet answered. What's the first step? Where can people find you?
Look, the best thing for people to do is to reach out on LinkedIn, on email. We'll include all of those things are going to be in the show notes for sure, and you'll be able to find that, whether you're listening to this on one of the platforms, podcast platforms, or you're coming to the website. CommTogether.com.au is my website, and just click along there to book in a 15-minute catch up. Let's have a conversation and just start seeing where you're at and seeing if I can help you in some way or another, because that's the other thing too, that if I can't help you, chances are I probably know someone who can, and I'm more than happy to steer you in that direction and help you out if that's the case. Because if I can make an impact for you in some small way, I'm positive I can give you some insight in that 15-minute session that's going to be of value to you. And if it leads to us working together, that's fantastic. If it pushes you in another direction, that's also a great outcome.
Awesome. So thank you kindly, Anthony Perl, for reversing today and taking up my challenge. You've done a wonderful, wonderful job, and I thank you on behalf of yourself and your own company. You have done brilliantly. Thank you.
Rik, thank you so much. I loved the opportunity, and thank you everyone for listening in.